Great to see everyone back on for this, what will be a fascinating discussion between Ellen and Lindley. Now, Ellen Broad, many of you will know, who is working in this space at ANU with Genevieve Bell, and Lindley Edwards, who has a number of hats, is at the AFG Venture Group. Both of them, welcome to you. I actually can't see you at the moment, so I'm just going to explore there. There you are. I've got myself sorted. And welcome, Ellen. I think you're from cold Canberra. You're sitting in cold Canberra. And Lindley, you're up the road in sunny Sydney.
Yes.
Now, I should remind people, because both of you have such amazing resumes, that we've got a little bit more detail about both of you on the Responsible Tech website. Now, we're going to discuss a lot of things today, and I will encourage everyone on the line to actually join in and chime in with questions and responses and takeaways and experiences as we go. To kick off, Ellen and Lindley, I was wondering, we're doing this survey, which is sort of looking at, you know, some of the attitudes people have around the building and delivering of products in Australia, and how tech is being currently used, and whether they've got concerns about that. And one of the questions we ask is, who do people believe should take responsibility for the consequences of a company's tech, and what the consequences it may have on people and society? And there is already a large percentage that are saying that the board and the leadership should have the final sort of responsibility. I just wondered if you could perhaps share, maybe Lindley, I'll see you've been chair and director of a number of worthy institutions. If you could perhaps kick us off, and then Ellen can chime in.
Okay, thank you, Rachel, and good morning, everyone. From my perspective, this responsibility for technology, actually, yes, it ultimately sits with the board and it sits with the executive team. But what's really important is that the culture of an organisation thinks more deeply about what they're creating, and is it fit for purpose, and what are the unintended consequences. So I think that this is a new world that we're building, particularly some of the digitisation, particularly some of the things that we're able to do with data, particularly what we can do with algorithms and machine learning. So all of these things are creating a new digital world. So how do we, as individuals sitting in companies, and also sitting in not-for-profits and sitting in civil society, how do we make sure that these things work for us, and they actually are, you know, weapons not of mass destruction, as Kathy O'Neill says, but actually are things that positively enhance human life across the board. So I would say that it's everyone's responsibility. And yes, if you sit as a director or in the executive team, you have even more responsibility. And if you're in the tech team, you can't not have that responsibility. But I'm interested, Ellen, from your perspective, because you sit as a designer, as a technologist, and what your view is.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was thinking about, Lindley and I discussed this last week in a preparation for this session, and I've been reflecting on, in my career, I've sat in roles that have both been advising board members or being an advisor to a minister, where I've sat in the cabinet meetings and listened to the discussions that are had with the engineering teams, as well as sitting on the side as the engineering lead, presenting to boards and presenting to ministers on what it is that we're doing. And I know that we quite often say things like, everybody needs to take responsibility for technology. Everybody needs to take responsibility for an application's unintended consequences. But one of the things I'm really crucial of, having been on the engineering side, is how power dynamics are set within large, complex organizations. And that typically even defining what an unintended consequence is and what one would be that is important to the board and leadership can be really difficult. So I do think there is an extent to which an engineering team can call out and point to issues that they see with a service that they're designing. But ultimately, their ability to do that, they're being empowered to do that, rests at more senior levels of an organization. And I think we've seen that play out in a number of software scandals that, you know, yes, we say it's everyone's responsibility, but unless kind of hard expectations and hard guardrails and clear mechanisms of accountability are set at a leadership level, creating pathways for other parts of an organization to draw out issues of unintended consequences. One of the biggest problems I see in applied contexts is quite often the strategic KPIs set by an organization, which might be about generating a particular profit, or facilitating efficiency goals, or facilitating cost savings, can come into conflict with some of the unintended consequences of a software layer that is being designed many layers down the organization. So I just think, yes, it is everyone's responsibility. The ability to take action, though, in the face of unintended consequences is something that there is very much a power dynamic involved with. And therefore, I think your executive and your leadership do need to be cognizant of that power dynamic, that ultimately it's about their receptiveness to things being pointed out.
Well, I think
Ellen,
that doesn't,
sorry, Lindley. I just wanted to ask, because she brought up guardrails, and I just wondered if you could maybe talk a bit about whether they should be internal or external.
I don't know if that was to me or Lindley, but I actually think both. And there's something relatively, there's something that is a bit of a relief about external guardrails being set when you're designing a technology, because it also makes it easier to have hard conversations internally when you can say, look, it's out of my hands. I have to, for example, insert an independent audit of the application of this particular technology, or it's out of my hands. I have to comply with this obligation to disclose something about how our technology works. I also think there's guardrails that can be set internally, mainly in the context of things like breaking down organizational silos. So facilitating mechanisms to solicit feedback from different parts of an organization, mechanisms to have regular reporting to a board, internal governance mechanisms. But I think it's both. There is something that removes pressure when you have some external guardrails. They can be a real pain in the ass, but they can also make it easier to have difficult conversations internally.
So just adding to that, I totally agree, Ellen, it's the ability to have difficult conversations, and that gets into culture. And as a board member, what I'm really interested in is not the happy campers where everything has gone really well. I'm really interested in, say, if you look at my experience in banking, the people that actually don't qualify for loans, that you're using automated algorithm. I'm really interested in the fringes, and I'm also interested in looking at people who are complaining about your service or complaining about your organization, and being able to shift and sift through what those people are saying. So for me, it's a culture that you create, and a culture of accountability, and a culture of openness. Because if you don't have a culture of openness, the issue that you have as a board or as an executive, you're dealing with people who are highly specialized, and you might not have that specialization. So you need to know what you do and don't know, but you also need lots of people to tell you what's going on. So there's that open communication, and what we talked about the other day of creating a shared language.
And it makes me really excited to hear you talk about that, to talk about a culture of openness and talk about a feedback culture. One of the observations that I've had working in really large organizations, as in, we're talking large government departments, 22,000 staff, is that in practical terms, even where your executive, your leadership, your minister or your board are saying, we want an open culture, we want greater feedback, we want greater reflectiveness, there's still a kind of cultural change that has to happen at that next middle level of management, who quite often, you know, just speaking really frankly, sometimes they can actively prevent that culture of openness from blossoming as the executive or the leadership wants it to occur, because you've got different layers of management with their own KPIs and their own kind of contexts and histories with a company. So one of the things that I think can even push that a little bit further, and it's something that I know, for example, we used in the UK in the department for Environment and Rural Affairs, where they were digitizing and combining massive quantities of data across organizations, is set up mechanisms to hold the next level of management to account for fostering that open culture and fostering that consideration of outliers, and the consideration, as you said, you are asking all the right questions and you are concerned with and wanting to promulgate an open culture. And I think of the amount of times I've had conversations with people in large organizations who want to point out issues to the executive leadership, who want to bring things to the perspective of their boards or their truly top level of the organization, and are prevented from doing so by their more direct managers. So I just think how we make sure it trickles down through an organization is really important.
And there's a capacity to hear bad news and unwelcome news, and then to act on it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the thing is, if we want to know about the unintended consequences of a technology, then being like, we know we have a limited bandwidth for bad news, but I guess there's a kind of question here for me around to what extent do our responsibilities as leaders extend to having to hear the bad news, irrespective of like whether we want to or not. You know, like, what's our responsibility to just, even though it complicates things, even though it just adds pain to your to kind of the day-to-day operations of a business, you know, to what extent can we say now's not the time for bad news?
I like that one. I wondered if you had advice from people, for people, on how, and Lindley, maybe this one's back to you, on how board members or senior execs can scrutinize what's happening. And counter to that, I think you brought it up, Ellen, you know, what mechanisms can you actually use to hold that next level to account? You know, so from one down to the, you know, from people who maybe don't understand the nitty gritty, how do they have the conversations, and vice versa? How do you have the conversations the other way as well? The difficult conversations, Lindley.
Okay, so the only way, that, you know, gets into Stoic philosophy for me, is the only way out of something is through it. And even if you don't like it and it's unpleasant, to actually keep walking into it and see what unfolds and see how you can use that in a positive way. For me, it is hard as a generalist to hold people very, very accountable when that is not your specialty. So part of what you do as a board is to actually make sure the board has enough training on digitization and technology and AI and machine learning, so there's at least a working knowledge of those things. It also means that you at times will form subcommittees of people who are real experts that can come and help the board and help the executives who are not as familiar with some of the concepts. But it also is to actually say, as an organization, you as our technology engineers and our tech team, how do you create a language that we can all understand what you're doing? And the other thing is to create KPIs that you get as a board and keep evolving those KPIs so that you can actually see what you're creating. But I'm really interested in anything that touches people. The thing that I do the most is see the people that aren't happy or have fallen in the cracks, because they're the ones that's where you can unpack things. without having a big specialty in technology.
Yeah, and I think to add to the to Lindley's point about expertise, I've been really fortunate to work both in Australia and overseas with some phenomenal engineering leads. I can actually see some names on the list of attendees here that I recognize. And one of the things that I'm really conscious of, both having kind of listened to boards and ministers make sense of complex technology projects, as well as I said, being in the opposite position of presenting on them, is there are kind of, in a gross generalization, 3 kinds of engineering leads. And I'll focus on that middle leadership level and not the team themselves, because they do serve, as you said, Lindley, this kind of translation function up. They're supposed to explain what they're doing and be able to communicate and connect it with what a larger organization is doing. And I've encountered kind of 3 types in my work. The first are just great engineering leads and also great communicators. So they can both meet an executive team where their expertise is, because they have a significant amount of expertise in managing and shepherding large organizations. So even though they're not computer scientists by training, they have expertise that is to be respected and talked into. Then there's engineering leads that are great engineering leads and just not very good communicators. But it's just something that they've never had a lot of training in or investment in. And so they just genuinely struggle to communicate, but it's not from a position of ill will, or it's just that they're not very good at it. The third category, which I feel like is what you really sniff out as the executive board, and the kind that I would call the bad lead, are ones who kind of believe that you shouldn't be able to ask them questions, or you shouldn't be able to demand more information about what they do unless you can do what they do. That kind of myth of exceptionalism of, and they will frame that in the way they communicate. They will return to really technical language. They will make it difficult to ask questions at a higher level. They will, whenever a question is asked at a higher level, bring it back into the technology. And that is not always the case. And if that is what you're experiencing, not you, Lindley, but I mean anyone at a technical level, know that there are other kinds of engineering leads who are a lot better, who are not comparing themselves to everybody else in terms of the expertise that they have that others don't. Because genuinely, I can't think of another industry, or at least the industries where these information asymmetries exist all the time. So I'm talking about medicine, law, software engineering, civil engineering, construction, architecture, which are service industries. You are providing services, you're providing expertise, you are building things, you are providing tools, where you can say, which we used to say, I think it's on the way out. I think we're not doing it anymore, I hope. But we used to say things like, everyone needs to learn to code, or politicians need to learn to code, or executives need to learn to code, and then they can ask what we're doing. That, I think, is unique to a certain extent to this industry, because we don't have that same, what I call the bad kind of approach to that translator role in, in medicine or law. You're expected to be able to communicate to a certain extent because there an information asymmetry exists. So that third category, where that attitude or that inability to communicate comes from, well, I shouldn't have to explain what I'm doing to you. If you want to understand it, you should learn to code, or you should learn computer science. That's the kind where, and whenever I've been on the minister side or the executive side, that's where you lean on it and keep pushing them to come back to your level, because that's the kind of culture that breeds problems within an organization. It breeds silos. It breeds poorly designed technology solutions. In no other industry, really, do we kind of still support that kind of exceptionalism. So I think there's great engineering leads who are great communicators, great engineering leads who are just not very great communicators. And then there are great engineering leads technically who are bad communicators because they think they shouldn't have to communicate to people who don't think like them.
And I've had some experiences of some of those people. But my normal way of dealing with that is to say, I need to understand what you're doing so that I understand the risk. And if I don't understand the risk of something, then how can I effectively be an executive or be a board member of this organization? And once people start, well, then this is when they understand that why you're asking these questions, then that often helps. And it is this thing about being open to being taught, because I think this is the other thing as a board, you know, someone's got deep expertise. There is a level of they're going to teach us as a board or as a, you know, some certain things. But it's this ability to create shared language and to say we are, as an organisation, seeking to achieve these strategic goals and work in this risk appetite. And we need to understand what each other does.
Lindley, do you want to talk a little bit more about the appetite for risk? It's come up, Tim Prosser has mentioned on the chat that boards need to be willing, open and receptive to hearing and learning about risk and the likelihood and impact raised via an org's risk management process. I mean, do you want to expand a little bit on that?
Yeah, you know, obviously having spent my life a lot in banking and finance, it's all about risk and it's all about taking risk. And that is in the risk appetite statement and avoiding or mitigating all the risks that aren't. So from my perspective, what I find is most boards aren't really aware, unless they are an APRA regulated entity or a financial services business, of what risks they're taking. And sometimes they will not take the risk they should because they don't understand that is a really perfectly great risk for that business to take. So risk is something that actually isn't taught very well. And if you look at all the behavioural economics, you can see that we don't really understand risk. And if you look at the Black Swan book, we don't understand the risks that we're taking. So risk is something that technology can actually help because what it can do is manage risk. But also risk is part of business and boards need to take risk, an organisation needs to take risk to survive and thrive. To not do anything is often as risky as doing something that's very has got a lot of innovation in it.
There was another question here by Omar Khalifa. Thank you, Omar, for this question. Ellen, this might be something with you, and I know this is a specific example around the Rio Tinto, explosion last week, and maybe there's another example that's closer to the whole responsible tech thing, but it still makes the same point that the Rio Tinto, of course, has an ethics policy and governance, but they could still do this without any, as far as we know, board or C-level objection. So are these sorts of policies, he's asked, so are corporates appearing to have gamed ethics? And so how do we ensure policies aren't just fig leaves?
So I was thinking about Lindley's discussion of risk and how that relates to ethics, because I think there is a lot of ethics washing in general, as in I remember 3 or 4 years ago being so excited about the rise of ethical technology and ethical AI, and then speaking to someone who was a business ethicist, and he said, yes, businesses always get very interested in ethics when they see it as a way of staving off regulation. And he was a long-term ethicist in other industries. And so I have to acknowledge that ethics washing, creating ethics policies as a way of perhaps mitigating some reputational risk, that is a thing that exists. One of the things that I was reflecting on about risk specifically in large organizations, and I think it goes to, I really enjoyed Laura's presentation just before this, and about the difference between something potentially being unfair and unfair to some population or unfair to, in one context, whether that amounts to something that an organization would consider a risk in the way that organizations consider risk, which is usually financial risk, regulatory risk, reputational risk. But typically when you're thinking about reputational risk, you're thinking about it in a kind of quite direct way. Like, will this stop people from purchasing my services? Will this prevent people from coming to my store? Will this see us lose business in future? So your reputational risk is not, there are some fantastic organizations who make ethical values and principles the heart of the way that they do business, but quite often practically as an organization managing risk, you're thinking about risk in a much more pragmatic and straightforward sense. So when I think about the work in fairness, and when we talk about responsible technology, one of the things that we have to come to grips with in the relationship between ethics and risk is that sometimes acting ethically or acting more responsibly in the design of your technology could pose what in another context would be considered a risk for an organization. It might result in a temporary loss of income. It might mean not doing something. So that's one relationship that I think we need to consider, that sometimes being ethical or being responsible means not doing something or doing less of something that would be considered a risk or would have to be evaluated as a risk. The second is that there are some kinds of things that are unethical and unfair, but are just not that risky for a business. I know that a lot of the work that we've done in fairness at 3AI, it bubbles up that there are kinds of unfairness that organizations really care about because they could get sued for it. It could be in breach of some prudential obligation, or it could be in breach of their obligations under racial vilification laws. And then there's kinds of unfairness that are unfair, but it's really hard to see them as serious enough to warrant large organizational action, because you end up trying to balance them against your risk sheet. Like, yes, we could do something, but actually we have quite a complex set of risks to balance. So I think there is this really complex relationship between what is responsible and ethical and what is risky. And, you know, you could look at Rio Tinto's blowing up of the 40,000-year-old caves, which I don't condone, as evaluating risks for their business according to their own evaluation of risk and deciding it was less risky to blow up 40,000-year-old caves and cop some reputational damage than not to blow them up. And I'm not condoning it. That is where I think you need extremely clear external guardrails, and here they were insufficient, that would actually make clear that there are some things that even though we could do them, we shouldn't do them.
I just want to pick up on your point about these insignificant risks, Ellen. Often what technology and data allows you to do is actually aggregate insignificant risks. And I always think about like A&P, which was charging people incorrectly, which was all lots of little tiny things that actually end up becoming a big thing. So one of the great uses of technology, if you prepared and data, is you can actually start to see that and get those what seems like small little things, aggregate them and see what is actually happening to your risk profile.
Yeah, definitely.
As an organization, because the little thing for doing it to one person, that maybe that's okay, but when you're doing it to thousands of people, but in the end it's the thousands of people that you've created the problem with.
I think I was having a discussion with a friend yesterday about nothing to do with technology, but we were talking about the blindness that we have as individuals, as organizations, to lots of different kinds of unfairness around us. You can talk about racial bias, sex-based bias, ableism, organizational bias. There is blindness, but then at a point at which unfairness is pointed out to you, then it becomes whether you're willfully blind because it's more difficult or too hard to do something about it, and therefore complicit, or whether you do something about it. Because I think even in that context where you might find out that thousands of people are disadvantaged by your service as an organization, there's still a choice that organizations have as to whether they act on that and change the service. And some would, and some wouldn't, because it doesn't cost them anything to continue to maintain the status quo. And that's where I think you get into, you know, what is our set of obligations when a systemic bias like that, or a systemic kind of unfairness is pointed out, that's not technically illegal, that's not going to get us in any trouble. What is our moral obligation to act on it? And what do we just let slide because the status quo is easier to maintain?
Which it also goes to when you create something and then it becomes a problem later on that you didn't know, and the unintended consequence, where something is perfect for the environment that it's created in, but in as information and as technology and as wisdom evolves, how do you redress the harm that you might have created? You know, and obviously the really easy one to use as an example is tobacco, where doctors were saying it was okay for people to smoke. And then the later information comes out that, you know, it creates cancer. So I'm very aware that sometimes you're creating things that down the track may create other problems, which will take some time to unfold.
There's another question here that I might just ask from Wayne. So he has asked the question, your outline embraces the concept of risk management for a company using a service and for the company providing the service. So there are two sides to the story and implicit assumptions made in undertaking any transaction. This is real for small companies. Do either of you want to comment on the two sides to the story?
Thank you for your question, Wayne. I'm not quite sure I'm going to answer it the way that you've intended it, but one of the things that it made me think about is that the concept of what a risk is will differ based on whether you're the company providing a service or the company using the service. So for example, if you're a small supplier that's been tasked with providing a service to a large organization within a particular time frame, then their risks are all about efficiency, cost blowouts, speed of delivery. So their risks are kind of, as the organization who's commissioned a service, their risks are about making sure that the supplier delivers the service on time, under budget or on budget, definitely no blowouts. And so they will encourage and push for speed and efficiency, where as an organization providing a service, a classic problem with the supply of technology services is we always want them to be done with way less people than they actually take, at a faster time frame than they probably should take, and with poor understanding of some of the complexities associated with integration and interoperability. So you essentially have these mismatched risks, and they're real, and they are real and mismatched. So how we negotiate in that sticky area where, you know, the risks for the supplier might be that the service that you're supplying actually isn't going to do the job that you know it needs to do, or it might not do exactly what the provider thinks it's going to do, or you might think it shouldn't be used in this context at all, and that's not a very good idea. You have a different set of risks to the one that's spending all of the money on the service that you're supplying. So I think it's complex. It's really hard. And I think, yes, we all talk about ethics and ethical policies, but there's this issue which is like mismatched risks and misaligned risks between different parts of the ecosystem involved in designing, deploying, and using technology.
And I'm going to add to that, and I don't know, Wayne, if I'm going to add to that or not, but I think that the world is full of mismatched risks. And, you know, like, let's take banking. What banks do is take deposits from smaller smaller depositors and sometimes larger depositors, and then that is normally at call, or at most it will go out. People will put their money in the bank for 3 months, 6 months, or up to a year, but they're lending that money out on 25-year terms. So that's a perfect mismatch, that what it requires is management. And there is also mismatching of risk happens when there's power imbalance. When someone has more power than the other, then what occurs is if you need that service or that good, you're actually, those goods, you're actually have to a taker of what is offered, not necessarily does it fit exactly in your risk profile.
Yeah, and I'm going to chime in here. I've been surprised how few big companies have we've found just in this challenge at Slatterys that so many of the smaller companies and the people we know have, you know, been so generous and kind, and yet some of the bigger companies that we work with have, you know, either with service agreements or just flexibility around things have been, and I know this, I speak for a lot of companies, have been quite surprised at the lack of leniency in this time. I wanted to ask about the times we're finding ourselves in and how much we're speeding up, you know, in these times digitally, and wondered what you two sort of feared about that. Are there things that concern you about how we will move into this new digital realm faster than and more furious than ever before, and what concerns you about how we do that with integrity?
I can kick off and then Lindley can take over. And there was one thing I wanted to reflect on, just because I know we've talked a lot about risk, and quite often when we talk about what's ethical, we end up talking about what's risky. And I just really want to drill the point home that, and quite often when we're like giving ethical advice to organizations, you're still trying to map it within their risk profile and fit it within what will generate most profit, what will still be easy and comfortable for that business. And I think it's really worth acknowledging that sometimes being ethical or upholding a moral obligation is risky for a business. And that's what makes it powerful. Like, it is when you make these clear positions, these clear stances, even if they cost you something, that is what is kind of the difference between something that's comfortable and something that's kind of putting you at the next level. And I think we need to acknowledge that. Just to your question specifically. So I'm probably unsurprising, like most of us on the call, I'm a roller coaster of emotion on any given day of the week. I kind of get whiplash on a weekly basis, that every amazing story of change is immediately followed by some awful story of change. And what is different is the scale of change is so fast and so dramatic. So on the technology side, I see things that I think, wow, ideas and concepts that we thought were fixed and unchanging in technology are suddenly unfixed. So I'm talking about the much more interventionist role Twitter has been playing, for example, in moderating and arbitrating information on its platform, which really goes against the like neutrality ethos that has shaped the technology industry over the last 25 years. I'm talking about the temporary bans on facial recognition that Amazon, IBM, and Microsoft have committed to. They're all kind of quite big statements. But then on the flip side, I also see a rush to lots of untested technologies that make me incredibly nervous, because this is a time within which we don't have the time to think about how they're deployed. And yes, it's great that large organizations say we're going to take a pause here for a bit. That doesn't stop the not so concerned businesses just pushing right ahead and filling the space. I'm thinking of Clearview AI, for example, that has been dominating the news all year as an example of a company that's really unlikely to say we're going to stop selling to law enforcement because we heard Amazon, IBM, and Microsoft have. Maybe they will. But there's so many examples of that across even responses to the pandemic. Drones that are going to take your temperature from 5 meters away, irrespective of the fact that that's a proxy for COVID-19 and not actually confirmation that you have COVID-19. I'm talking about image recognition software that's going to allegedly determine whether we're appropriately socially distancing from each other in public spaces, and yet cannot determine what is a family unit or what is a group of people who live together such that you can be within 1.5 meters of each other. So I see a lot of that. I see a lot of good stuff, and I also see a lot of bad stuff that we're moving too fast to think about reflectively and reflexively. Just seems like anything's possible.
I'll add to that, and I agree that everything is just got a lot faster. I think it's fast-tracked the digitisation by at least 18 months, 2 years. But what we've got to do, which as Ellen is referring to, is not throw the baby out with the bathwater, and also make sure that we're very considerate about what we do. And what I find is when extreme events happen, people tend to get into either or. I still think there is a capacity to hold and positions. And what does worry me the most about digitisation is what does that do to job loss, and particularly in certain more vulnerable people. And yes, it opens up lots of career paths, but also there are people that we are going to struggle to change into some of the newer skill sets. And that's not that I'm negative on what that means, but I do think we have to consider what happened in the car industry. And you look at some of those places that employed a lot of people in the car industry in Victoria and South Australia. Those people have find it very, very difficult to reskill, retool, and to actually find another means of creating work, because I think work is critical to people's well-being, and the ability to have a job is a central part of creating a good society.
Well, that's fantastic start to a conversation. I feel like we've just started, so but we've run out of time. I want to thank all of those people that asked questions. I can actually hear the backup music, which is meant to be like the Oscars, rounding us up, and you both are superstars for joining us today. Hopefully we'll have the opportunity to talk to you again in the future about some of these topics again as the world continues to move. So maybe hopefully with Responsible Tech 2021, that would be wonderful, and over a coffee or a drink rather than over Zoom, which isn't as personable. Mind you, it is very comfortable. So I want to thank everyone for joining us. Thank you, Ellen and Lindley. Upstanding, everyone. Have a